Stay Afloat is a local co-op party game that involves pirates on a ship that is constantly getting leaks and filling with water. And so the pirates have to survive for the duration of the journey by using the bucket to take water out of the ship and building planks and using those planks to plug in the leaks that keep appearing. The progress of the journey is slower depending on how much water there is in the ship. We first came up with the idea of this game during the Global Game Jam 2020, which had the theme Repair. At the time, it was actually called Pirate Plug, but we changed the name to Stay Afloat when we decided to continue working on it. Anyhow, the Game Jam was a huge success on our standards, and it was really well received by the other participants. At the time, actually, we had started working on another game, but we felt that the idea for Stay Afloat was so good that we decided to abandon the other project completely and continue working on Stay Afloat. And so the next part of the video will show how we improved dramatically from this version to the version that you now see.
One of the first major visual improvement we've made for Stay Afloat was updating the sea background look. In the Game Jam version, it was a plain color background. Afterward, I thought of making an animated and linear water surface animation, which didn't work so well and ended up not being appealing at all. I eventually decided of making a vertical sea animation background, which can be duplicated seamlessly for the entire screen. Hopefully, I will show more details for an upcoming tutorial video with a similar background animation. Another improved visual feature I have to mention is the boat itself. Since it is the center of the whole game in a literal way and where all the players will be moving, it has to be obviously readable and easy to understand. First and foremost, I did some work to expand it and make it look like a real pirate ship with a mast, a flag, and a work table, etc. We also worked on an overall map, which is reminiscent of classic JRPGs or to some recent games, such as Rogue Roof. We started first from a concept art to a pixel art version, and as I was working on the whole process, Ahmed used a placeholder to test the map mechanic in the game itself. This key visual feature will be useful for the players to freely choose their next destination and play the chosen level. The reason why we were fond of such idea was to give a sense of freedom for those playing the game and adventure, just like real pirates.
So now that we realized that Stay Afloat was the game we truly wanted to make, it was time to actually improve upon the Game Jam version. The biggest flaw from the Game Jam version was that both players didn't really need to truly cooperate. You can technically execute your tasks of dumping out the water and building planks to plug in the leaks. Technically, those two parts could be done independently of each other. So the one thing that we wanted to improve was to force that cooperation between players so that you actually needed to communicate and rely upon each other and produce those potentially rage-inducing moments as well where your partner won't listen to you or whatnot. And we actually had a few suggestions at the Game Jam about this, with one being including an option to press YTR. Well, this is irrelevant, but this will be explored in the future devlog. On a more serious note, the main suggestion that we took a looking for and that we implemented was to introduce obstructions that rely on the players to coordinate removing temporarily so that you can pass between the parts of the ship. So essentially, we decided those obstructions to be something along the lines of like elevators or doors and moving platforms that can all be triggered using floor switches, something that you find in Ocarina of Time, for example. So we designed these first three sample levels in order to test out these mechanics as well as to serve as the demo levels. The first one doesn't have any of these floor switches, but we want it to be super simple. So this one is testing out a rotating platform, something that you'd find in a Super Mario game. And this is just a cool way to introduce the players to the objectives of the game without needing to overcomplicate it with doors and stuff. The next level introduces the elevator, so this one needs the players to coordinate triggering the elevator's movement using the floor switches as mentioned before. The final level has two doors that move when the players stand on the floor switches. In these types of floor switches though, the player has to remain standing on it so that it can stay configured in the other way, because otherwise if you were to walk on it and to leave, it will return to its original state. So through implementing these sample levels, we experimented quite a lot and also fixed a myriad of bugs that were in the original Game Jam and improved code a lot through it, as well as the art, which Abdulhamid will further expand upon.
Thank you, Ahmed. We are actually planning to add a new feature, which is the enemies mechanic. Since the game loop focuses mostly on maintaining the ship until the end of your journey, the first task is to slow down the player and hinder them as well. For now, we are in a conceptual stage where I focus on making the art and animation. So far, we thought of making a mermaid, ghost, parrot, and pufferfish enemies. In the new feature, we hope to add them to upper the challenge in the game, and I'm also thinking of making some feature videos showing a more in-depth process to create their animation and the concept art pipeline as well.
So one major flaw that we noticed in the game so far was building planks and using those planks objects to plug into leaks was a little too boring with regards to the gameplay. As essentially, you're simply creating a lot of objects that you have to manually move over to the place where the leaks are, and it's quite a tedious process. It's really almost more like manual labor than it actually is a game. So to spice this up, we have discussed the idea of implementing enemies that serve as hazards for the players in journey mode, which Abdulhamid will expand upon later. The enemies will basically be hazards that affect the player but can also be eliminated by the player. So initially we thought of having a sword item that the player can pick up and deal with the enemies. However, we soon realized that we can actually do this in a better way, that instead of introducing a whole new item, we can make a hammer item that can solve the plank problem and this at the same time. Essentially, instead of having plank objects that you move around one at a time, you just have a single hammer item. In order to build planks, the player would have to pick up the hammer and go to the workbench and perform the action of creating planks, and the number of planks will simply be represented as a number next to the hammer. And in order to plug in a leak, you simply have to go there with the hammer and perform the action of plugging in the leak, which will then reduce the amount of planks that you have. But at the same time, the hammer can also be used to deal with enemies. It would serve the same purpose as a sword, so instead of whacking enemies with a sword, you're simply whacking them with a hammer. So this reuse of the hammer action for these two separate tasks, we agreed would create some more dynamic and fun gameplay. Likewise, we applied the same concept to the bucket as well, where the bucket, which is primarily used to take water and dump it out of the ship, could potentially be used as well to splash water in any general direction. An example of using this could be that there could be a hazard that would put one of the players to sleep. The other player can take the bucket, fill it with water, and then splash that sleeping player to wake him up. All that said, implementing the newly redesigned bucket and hammer is going to take quite a bit of time, because it's going to involve a lot of changes to the animations, as well as the code related to the items. Currently, the way the items are being moved is that they're essentially separate objects that are being moved at the same time as the player carrying them is. With the way our game is configured, this greatly limits the amount of dynamic actions you can perform. So one thing that we definitely wanted to include in our game was to have epic long-range ship battles. We thought that it would be a fun way to put in between segments that normally involved taking the water out of the ship and plugging in the leaks and whatnot. We brainstormed quite a lot for this feature, as it had a lot of things to talk through. Eventually, what we decided to do was come up with two different gameplay mode types. So the regular gameplay that it just involves staying afloat within the ship and seeing the ship's interior, that we call the journey mode. And the actual battle portion, we creatively called it battle mode. So the idea was that we would have pirate enemies or even boss fights that occur in the background, and the players would coordinate moving the ship and firing back at the enemy. So that could make for an example a boss fight at the end of a level section, or an intermediate fight where perhaps we can transition between these two gameplay modes via a little cutscene of sorts. So anyhow, before even going into detail about all the more complex stuff, we had to first test it out through some prototypes. I tried prototyping it with pure 2D physics, with the idea that maybe I can simulate the depth of the cannonball and the depth of the background elements by using a lot of black magic math to make everything scale properly. However, when I first tried it out, with the initial idea of just firing the cannon straight up like a mortar and having it land in the background, it didn't work so great. I felt like that it's going to result in a lot of future issues. So what I decided to do is see if maybe we can use Unity's built-in 3D environment anyway, and maybe make it a 2.5D mode. That proved to be significantly better. Not only was it much easier to program, but it also looked nicer. The firing of the cannon just looked much more natural, and it opened up a lot more possibilities with mixing in 3D. Given that, we're definitely going to build on this prototype and introduce other features into it, and that we will show in future devlogs. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and be sure to subscribe to catch future videos. Our demo is available to try for free on itch.io and GameJolt. Check it out and give us your feedback and suggestions. Links are in the description. As well, follow us on social media to keep up to date with our development progress. Links for those are in the description as well.